Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast presented by Bee Culture. Beekeeping Today podcast is your source for beekeeping news, information, and entertainment. I'm Jeff Ott.
I'm Kim Flatham.
And I'm Kirsten Traynor.
Today's sponsor is Global Patties. They're a family-operated business that manufactures protein supplement patties for honeybees. It's a good time to think about honeybee nutrition. Feeding your hives protein supplement patties will ensure that they produce strong and healthy colonies by increasing brood production and overall honey flow. Global offers a variety of standard patties as well as custom patties to meet your needs. No matter where you are, Global is ready to serve you. Visit them today at www.globalpatties.com.
Hey, thanks a lot, Sherry. We really appreciate our sponsors' support. They help make all of this happen and help provide us the ability to expand and grow, as you'll see in coming months. With that, thanks to Bee Culture Magazine for continuing their presenting sponsorship of this podcast. Bee Culture has been the magazine for American beekeeping since 1873. Subscribe to Bee Culture today. And while you're there, check out Bee Culture's Beekeeping Your First 3 Years, a quarterly magazine for beginning beekeepers. We also want to thank 2 Million Blossoms as sponsor of this episode. 2 Million Blossoms is a quarterly magazine dedicated to protecting all pollinators. Learn more on our Season 2, Episode 9 podcast with editor and our guest co-host Kirsten Traynor, and from visiting www.2millionblossoms.com, and that is with the number 2. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. We're glad you're here because we've got a great episode for you. Hey Kim, hey Kirsten.
Hey Jeff, how you doing?
Hey, Jeff.
Doing good.
We had our first snow here this week, Jeff. Winter is here, and I'm gonna just disappear. I'm gonna go under the desk for 4 months.
Did you get all your hives wrapped up?
See, that's why I'm going under the desk. No, I haven't yet. I'm going to be doing.
And Kim, you don't have a whole hive to keep you warm and well fed underneath the desk. So I mean,
behind as usual.
And Kirsten, how are you doing?
I'm good. I just learned that the magazine has won some seed funding, which I'm very excited about based on our pitch and our customer traction. So great news for the magazine, and it will allow us to keep building.
Some pollinator seed funding. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, congratulations. And that's with who? Who's providing?
That was through Arizona State University's Venture Devil program. They are very much focused on building the next generation of entrepreneurs. And so they have these different tracks available, both to students and faculty and staff. And so I qualified as faculty and staff. And the 2 Million Blossoms magazine was just awarded all the prize money in the track that we were eligible for.
Wow.
That's fantastic.
Wow, that's
exciting.
great.
So we'll be using that to roll out a podcast and redevelop the website.
Excellent.
Yeah, we have a couple things in development here, don't we? Kirsten, you want to talk a little bit about your podcast that you're developing and we'll be bringing out?
Yes. So since 2 Million Blossoms is beyond just the topic of beekeeping, we're going to be rolling out a 2 Million Blossoms podcast on all pollinators, which gives me a chance to speak with scientists and pollinator enthusiasts, and not just beekeepers. While I love and adore beekeepers, I'm also fascinated by all the other critters out there that are buzzing and helping to keep us well fed.
Very cool. And Kim, you were working on a new podcast that we're going to swarm off here from this the Beekeeping Today podcast. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Jim, too, and I kind of putting our heads together, and we're kind of going back to 3 years ago. We were doing webinars when I was still with Bee Culture. We called it the Kim and Jim Show. So we're kind of taking that same tack, but it's going to be all things bees. So we've given it the name Honeybee Obscura, Kim and Jim Talking Bees. And we've already done one, and we've got 2 more lined up in the next week or so. So look for that in 3 weeks. Should be ready.
Very good. Yeah, those aren't, neither of those are out yet, the Honeybee Obscure or 2 Million Blossoms podcast, but we are in development with those, and they will be out shortly after the first of the year, right? So stay tuned, and we'll make a big announcement about it when they're both out and rolling.
And keep your eye on the Beekeeping Today webpage, because that's where you'll see the first announcement for both of these, and then they'll have their own webpage links and what have you. But you'll be able to find them early on Beekeeping Today webpage.
Yeah, we'll do a little cross-pollinating if you will.
There you go.
So, Kim, you talked about your first snow, and we had our first real hard cold snap. And I'm sure a lot of people around the country are experiencing that, at least in the northern latitudes. So what should beekeepers be looking for in their bees in front of their hives and their bees this time of year, this first snap?
Well, if you have a good snowpack, I know a lot of new beekeepers get very concerned by the trail of dead bees in front of their hives. But I've always found that the further they can carry their dead, the healthier that colony actually is, because there's still plenty of bees in there to do the corpse carrying. And so you want a nice long trail coming out in front of your hive. You don't want your entrance blocked with dead bees.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking this early in the season, I'm hoping not to see any bees out there at all.
Obviously, that would always be best. It depends on how long and how cold it's been.
Yep. But so I peeked yesterday. I haven't seen anything. They weren't flying, but you could see them in the front door.
Must have been slightly warmer then.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, after a few days of hard frost and snow, it's an excellent time to do an oxalic acid treatment on a colony. They'll usually be pretty broodless. They'll have a nice tight cluster, and so you can do a very easy varroa dribble treatment on them. And you really want the bees clustered tightly for that. So 42 degrees is a perfect type of temperature early in the morning.
And be prepared to see a lot of dead mites if you have a screen bottom board. It's always very shocking, I think, to see the number of mites that drop when they're broodless. Hey, so Kim, you've been reading a lot lately. So what have you been reading this week?
And it's almost Christmas, and I like to think that people like reading to their children or to children of their friends. So I've got a couple of kids' books that we're going to turn out this month. First one is H is for Honeybee, a Beekeeper's Alphabet, and the other one is Kia and the Bees. And they're both really good stories. They're pretty to look at. They're easy to identify when you're looking at the page and reading it to a child. So we'll have one this time, and we'll have the other one next time.
All right, well, let's get into the first book review.
All right, Jeff, the book is called H is for Honeybee, a Beekeeping Alphabet. It's written by Robyn Smith van Frankenhuyzen. It's illustrated by Eileen Ryan Ewen, and it's published by Sleeping Bear Press. It's a kid's book, and it's incredibly well illustrated. The artist is just did wonderful things, and the publisher has a whole series of science and nature alphabet books, and this is their newest. Each page has a short rhyming verse filling 2/3 of the page, and the remaining is a sidebar with a ton of in-depth information about the subject of the letter presented on that page. The author is a beekeeper and wildlife rehabilitator, and the artist has illustrated many children's books and at both shows. Each letter of the alphabet explains some aspect of bees, beekeeping, or beehives. Here's a few samples. F is for flowers. When the bee leaves her hive, she's got one thing on her mind: the food she'll collect from flowers she finds. Or P is for propolis. Every nook and cranny and crevice is glued tight with propolis. Trees provide this sticky sap that bees can use as a mousetrap. Or W is for wax. On the underside of a bee, though it's rather hard to see, is a gland for making wax for building comb and sealing cracks. And that's how the whole book goes. Jeff, it's entertaining to read. The pictures are great, and then the detail that's included on each page is excellently done. This book is aimed at 6 to 10-year-old audience and their parents, of course, or perhaps a local helpful beekeeper, and would be a perfect book for STEM lessons, science, technology, education, and math. STEM lessons on environmental issues, conservation, bees, beekeeping, or for nature lovers in general. On the last page is a wealth of information on helping bees, fun facts about bees, and how to become a beekeeper, where the author encourages readers to do just that and to have fun. It's a very rewarding hobby, she adds, and it's my favorite thing, and I think I can say the same. It's one of my favorite things, certainly. So for Christmas, if you have a little beekeeper in your life or a little someone who wants to be a beekeeper, this might be just the gift. H is for Honeybee, a Beekeeping Alphabet.
Thanks, Kim. The books for the kids are great additions to anyone's library, so I encourage to our listeners to check them out. Kirsten, you met with Emily Bondor, right?
That is correct. Emily runs the Santa Cruz Bee Company, and I had met her at, I believe it was an EAS a few years back. And she is a treatment-free beekeeper, although she doesn't tend to use that term. She had emailed me, and we got into a conversation, and I had emailed back some pretty tough questions, and she was willing to sit down and have a very honest conversation about what it means for colony losses and management if you decide to forego synthetic treatments or organic treatments for varroa control. And I really enjoyed the conversation because I think a lot of times people avoid those more difficult questions, and she was perfectly willing to sit down and really talk in depth about what kind of losses you're going to be experiencing if you make that transition.
And can you explain what's the difference between treatment-free versus chemical-free versus natural beekeeping?
Well, I think it often depends on who you speak with. There's a lot of people who are completely intervention-free, and they want the bees to exist natural beekeeping very much on their own without sort of human management. Then there are people who are chemical-free, and so they can still do brood breaks, and they can do biotechnical interventions where they manipulate the hive through management, but they're not putting any chemicals or any organic controls for varroa into their hives. And some people define these terms slightly differently, so it really depends on the individual beekeeper. But yes, it's there. You can get into the very nitty gritty, and I've actually had a conversation with Steve of the Ambassadors because he's working with Colos, where they're trying to define natural and treatment-free beekeeping, and these terms can be very, very difficult to define.
Yeah, for everybody, experienced and non-experienced beekeepers. Let's get into your interview with Emily, but first, a word from Strong Microbials.
Hello, beekeepers. Your honeybees face a lot of challenges out there. Unbalanced food sources from monoculture crops, holding yards, drought, food shortages, antibiotics, pesticides, and pathogens like chalk brood. To overcome these challenges, your bees need the multiple bacteria that are in all nectars, pollens, and the environment. These bacteria aid honeybees' digestion and improve your honeybees' response and resilience to pesticides. Now you can help improve your honey colony health with a quick, easy, and safe-to-use product. Strong Microbials Super DFM Honeybee uses naturally occurring bacteria to restore the healthy gut biome of your honeybees. Check them out today at www.strongmicrobials.com.
I'm Dr. Kirsten Traynor, founder of 2 Million Blossoms, and today I have a chance to chat with Emily Bondor of the Santa Cruz Bee Company. Emily runs a treatment-free operation in California, teaches new beekeepers, and does a lot of outreach work. She's agreed to have a serious conversation about the benefits and costs of being treatment-free in a beekeeping world plagued by varroa. Emily, welcome to the show.
Hi, Kirsten. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So, Emily, can you tell our listeners how you got into beekeeping and what is unique about the Santa Cruz Bee Company?
Sure. So I started beekeeping in 2013, and I was living on the island of Maui in Hawaii.
I am jealous.
Yeah, it was beautiful. And so I was on an organic farm there, and we had a couple of beehives.
Okay.
And the beekeeper that kept those hives there, he came and did some, a little bit of work with the farm interns, building equipment and things like that, and gave us some intro lessons to beekeeping. And I started getting more interested in the bees. And he also had an operation running, producing queens.
Okay.
And so he wanted some help with grafting and, young people with good eyesight to help with grafting.
Yes.
So I was like, I had experience with trees, and I was like, why are we grafting fruit trees? And then I was like, oh, that's not the same thing at all. So I started working, before I really had any experience with bees at all. I started working in a queen rearing operation, running mating nukes and grafting.
That's
and doing
sort of an intense way of getting into it.
It was really intense, but I'm really a nerd at heart. And so I saw I learned all about bee biology and the cycles of the queen and everything, and, the right age larva to graft and all that sort of stuff. And so I started realizing within agriculture that, beekeeping was this niche, and within beekeeping, producing queens was something that was like a niche, even more within that was really kind of technical and specific. And I realized that I loved it. And so
there's something to rearing a queen, isn't there? It's sort of like, I did that.
Yeah, it's magical. A friend of mine said it's kind of like playing God.
It is. Like, it sort of is. It's like I get to change your destiny.
Yeah, exactly. So I was raising queens, and the beekeeper in Maui knew a guy in Napa Valley who runs a company called the Napa Valley Bee Company. His name's Rob Keller. Okay. And so I had lived in the San Francisco Bay Area previously before living in Hawaii. And when I moved back to the Bay Area in California, I reached out to Rob and said, hey, I'd love to come see your operation and kind of, get to see your bees. And I went up and helped him with an educational event. He teaches beekeeping at a Montessori school and, does all sorts of bee education and outreach. And so he was doing this event, and I helped him for the weekend. And then he said, hey, do you want to work for me? And I thought, well, I live 2.5 hours away from you in Santa Cruz, so it's not really convenient. But, at the same time, I realized it was a great opportunity. He's been keeping bees for, 20, 25 years.
Right.
So he invited me to work with him, and he has really been my main mentor for all things beekeeping. Okay. Primarily. And so I started working with him in 2014. And this year, because of the pandemic, I've only been up to Napa once. But at first, I was going up every week for 2 days and was working with him, staying over a night. And so I really got a crash course in he doesn't do as much raising of queens, but he does, hive management for private individuals and farms and vineyards and wineries. Napa Valley's wine country. And so,
it's very much outreach based. It's not sort of commercial beekeeping of
very much outreach based, micro apiaries, stationary beekeeping where he, places hives and then we'll go and he's like a mobile beekeeper. Okay. And so I saw his model and what he was doing with, education outreach and kind of mentoring youth in beekeeping and, all those sorts of things. And because I was in a different market, I was sort of able to mimic his business model in Santa Cruz without being in direct competition for work or clients or things like that.
Yeah. So that's actually a very customer service based business. I mean, you are
absolutely,
you are sort of at the whim and fancy of, but why do you want the bees there? It'd be so much prettier down there in the shade in that hollow.
Right. Yeah. And it's, my husband refers to me as a beekeeper keeper. So that's really, it's really unique in that, a lot of people start keeping bees and they'll have, backyard beekeeper, a couple of hives, or they might be more commercial and have, a couple of out apiaries, but it's, really solitary and they'll just, do pollination services, contracts, or they'll do honey or things like that. And for me, it's very much, it's pretty much 50-50 in terms of the care of the bees and the care of, the people that I work with and making sure that they're happy with what they're receiving in terms of services. So it's really, it's unique in that way.
So you must have no fear at all of picking up a telephone and actually calling people.
No, I'm pretty well versed in, customer service, sorts of customer relations and all that sort of stuff.
Very, very important skill set. I think a lot of people sort of fall into an educational business and they're actually very shy individuals. And that can be very difficult then to sort of do the marketing aspect. That's the part I struggle with. I'm not naturally a sort of pick up the phone and start yapping at somebody and selling myself. And that is a skill set that's very important and hard to develop. So it's pushed me out of my comfort zone a few times, especially into more leadership roles too. Like I was the Santa Cruz Beekeepers Guild
president for 3 years. And so I hadn't, done many things in leadership before. And then I was like, oh, I'm running this group now. So, but it's good. I think it's really important skill building. So
it is. And if you can work with people, you'll be good in life. So
yeah.
Treatment-free versus varroa treatment can be a very hot debate topic, almost as divisive as current day politics. Why did you make the decision to go treatment-free?
Yeah. So, a big reason for it. So when I was in Maui, and one of the reasons for really wanting to start working with bees on the mainland is because when I was in Maui, we did not have varroa mite there. And I think still there's no varroa on Maui, but I haven't double checked. But that was something that I had heard about it and knew it was this thing and thought, okay, I need to figure out what's going on. And then when I started working with Rob Keller from the Napa Valley Bee Company, that was really where I learned the bulk of my skills and hive management and all that sort of stuff. And he is treatment free. And so that was sort of, that was sort of how that came to be, is that I was learning, hands-on directly with someone, and that was their approach. And I saw the value and benefit of it. And then that's been further reinforced for me through the work of people like Dr. Thomas Seeley and Dr. Marla Spivak, and the research and data that they've been putting out about things like varroa sensitive hygiene and the adaptability of bees through things like epigenetics and kind of following some of that research to show that over time, left to their own devices, the bees can develop some of this kind of natural resistance to varroa. And so that's really appealing to me from the perspective of, understanding, if we give the bees the space and the time to grow and adapt, they're usually pretty good at doing that. And that if you, kind of throw chemicals at the problem, that may, prevent the bees from upregulating those genes and developing those abilities as quickly. So that was sort of, that's kind of been my approach. Mm-hmm. But I do totally, I'm well aware of the kind of rift in the beekeeping world between those who use treatments and those who don't use treatments, and also just management practices in general. So I think, a lot of times treatment-free beekeepers, some of them are really, able to manage their hives very carefully and closely. And then there's also the treatment-free beekeepers that might be the, brand new first-year beekeeper that wants to practice natural beekeeping, but they're getting their bees from a lineage of bees that have always had treatments. And so it's sort of wishful thinking that they would just be able to immediately adapt. And so there's all these sorts of challenges there.
Right. So I know a lot of the tendencies for varroa resistance tend to be smaller colonies, a little more swarmy, more propolis collection. Some studies show also more aggressiveness. I mean, the Africanized bees or the scutellata that have come up from the south are, of course, very well adapted to varroa, managed to survive extremely well, but aren't necessarily your customer-friendly bee.
Exactly.
And so how do you sort of manage customer expectations, since you're often managing bees for others, and the situation where they live? I imagine that some of these beekeepers probably live in very urban environments. It's much more difficult to be treatment-free in an area where you are not isolated, right? And your population is intermixing
Absolutely.
And interacting with others.
Yeah. And so in those situations, it's really important to remember, what are your management protocols for, being a treatment-free beekeeper, as in not using inputs in the hive.
Right.
But treatment, the term treatment-free usually is referred to that, to not using some kind of input to kill varroa mite. But I think it's really important to remember that there are all sorts of what are called, manual or mechanical treatments that are physical manipulations within the hive that you can do to manage for varroa. So I think as a treatment-free beekeeper, it's really important to still carefully monitor your varroa populations. And if they're getting out of control, to do a brood break by splitting the hive or, removing or isolating your queen. You could do things like culling drone brood, You could do like the powdered sugar dusting. So there's some of these different things that you could do that are still treatments, but not chemical treatments. And then it's just really important to realize that, we're not in an isolated situation all the time. Depending on where you are, you may have more, ability to control some of those variables, but especially in urban and suburban beekeeping, that's very difficult to do. So it's just important to remember that you still need to manage and inspect your hives and be aware of how they're doing.
And so how do you actually monitor for varroa in your colonies?
Yeah, so the way that I typically monitor for varroa, most of my colonies, since I have sort of micro out apiaries in all sorts of, places around Santa Cruz County, and then, sometimes a bit further too. So in order for me to manage all of those colonies, I have sort of like a monthly rotation.
Okay.
And so I'll visit hives about once a month. And on those colonies, I have a screened bottom board. And so I'll have a monitoring tray below that. And then I will examine that monitoring tray when I do my monthly inspection. And depending on the amount of mites on the tray, I may not count every single one, but I'll make an assessment of, lower end, medium to high mite loads. And then I'll look at that also within the context of how the brood looks in the colony. So I'll do a physical visual inspection of the brood nest, and I'll look to see, what the quality of the brood is. Like, it seems like if there's, slumping larvae and, dead pupa, or, bees half emerged dead in the cell, bees with wing deformity, all those sorts of things obviously are going to be tied to a really severe varroa infestation.
Right.
So on a colony like that, I know that, there's really an intervention that needs to happen immediately. On a colony that maybe there's, medium to high mite load, but the brood nest looks really healthy. There's a good population of adult bees. They don't appear to be sick. The colony has enough food resources within the hive, and things seem to be functioning pretty well otherwise. I'll make a note to kind of keep an eye on the mite loads, but that they might not need necessarily a brood break or anything at that time. And then also when I'm looking at the tray, I'm also looking to see what the ages of the mites are, and if there are mites that are moving around, because those can sometimes indicate if the colony is demonstrating hygienic behavior by uncapping cells or grooming themselves or each other. So those are sort of the things I'm looking for.
Right. And so, I mean, I've noticed that sometimes you can have, a colony that's really booming. It's getting really big. The brood pattern looks incredible. And then you can come back, it seems sometimes a month later, and the colony has shifted quite dramatically because varroa mites, viruses, that whole combination of problems has gotten out of hand. So when you find a colony like that, where you are seeing chewed down pupae and sunken cappings or some deformed wing, what do you then do to help rescue that colony? I mean,
yeah. So if it seems like it's kind of like past the point of no return, if it seems like, suddenly the population is super small and there's, parasitized or abandoned brood, and it just looks like the colony is really sick and maybe not capable of, making a new queen on their own or even accepting a new queen, or if it kind of seems like it's kind of, Rob Keller sometimes says circling the drain. So it looks like that colony maybe won't make it back. I think it's really important to remember that that colony has mites and is, basically, those kind of mite bomb colonies. And so it's really important to remember, if you have a colony like that, to shrink them down and remove a lot of the things that are going to be tempting to other bees to try and prevent the spread of mites by robbing. So pulling excess honey stores and shrinking them down to just a few frames within maybe one box where the bees are, reducing their entrance way down so that other bees can't get in, like, a half inch, so like one bee can get in and out. Just reducing them way down, and then, trying to make sure that at least those, mites that are in that colony aren't spread further. I have started kind of within this year, I've been managing more apiaries for people, hives that don't belong to me and that are, belong to other people. And they're like, oh, I want to treat my hive. Can you apply this treatment for me? Which previously I'm like, I don't even want to do that. I just don't want to even be associated with that. And this year I've kind of realized, okay, it would be good for me as an informed beekeeper to be able to observe those things and track that data. So I have started, a couple of colonies this year I did apply treatments to, for other individuals because they wanted to have that done, which I'm glad to have done so that I can kind of observe those outcomes. Mm-hmm. So I think in those situations, like you were saying, you can have a colony that's really big, looks beautiful, everything looks good. And then a month later, turn the corner to being really in bad shape. They talk about, I always remember the date that they say to, if you're going to apply a treatment, they say August 15th, which is my birthday. So I always remember that date, that's like a critical time for mite management. So I think it's really important during the summer, and I always tell this to new beekeepers, you have mites in your colony in the spring. You just don't really see them as much because they're behind the capped brood and they're kind of reproducing. And then as your mite populations will creep up, and your queen is laying less kind of after the summer solstice. And so then you start to see this tipping point where you get really high visible phoretic mite loads in the colony. So next year, I'm looking forward to starting to implement more of like the alcohol wash tests and things like that, a little bit more in the testing end of things earlier on, just to collect that data. That doesn't necessarily mean that I will automatically then say, oh, okay, this is the threshold. I'm definitely going to use a treatment, even though that's kind of what's in the literature. But I think it's just really, it's good. It's a good practice to inform kind of your understanding of varroa mite biology within a beehive. And then also, for the folks that I'm working with, like I'm teaching classes at the community college and things like that, for those newer beekeepers to get to see some of those practices and see that data collection is, I think, really valuable for newer beekeepers.
Right. And I think it's also very difficult, I think, for a lot of people to visualize their mite population. As you say, in the spring, your brood nest is really booming. You have lots of drone. The varroa mites are preferentially invading drone brood. And it really isn't until a colony starts to shrink, the colony stops rearing drone, all of your varroa mites are now forced into your worker brood. And then, all of a sudden you start seeing these huge escalations in mites.
It can be like a crazy, just like that tipping point. And so it's really important to understand that and to know that, there could be trouble in paradise.
Right.
Better Bee is pleased to present the interviews by Kirsten Traynor. As a supplier to our nation's beekeepers for over 40 years, Better Bee provides the tools, equipment, and information you need to succeed. Through its many beekeeping employees, Better Bee serves you with solutions to your beekeeping challenges. That's why they can say with confidence that they are your partners in better beekeeping. Thanks to Better Bee for their informative catalog, website, supportive beekeeper education, and for sponsoring the series featuring Kirsten. Be sure to see the latest at betterbee.com.
Have you considered having like a sick, isolated outyard for colonies that are on their way out?
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. I haven't implemented that yet, but I think that would be a good thing to do. I would just have to figure out where that would be.
You definitely need a very isolated spot for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I may be able to find something like that. But another really interesting thing that I'd love to just touch on. I guess we could discuss this at the end too. But here in California, we've been having many years of drought, and then there's also been wildfires and all this stuff. And I've really been seeing that. Because I do track my genetics, and I've had some, queen lines that do really well, that are closer, to kind of the city of Santa Cruz and the suburbs. And I know that in the bee literature and the bee world lately, they've talked about how, the bees in urban and suburban areas actually tend to do better and have more diversity of forage.
Right.
And I've just really seen that the bees that I've been trying to keep in some of these more extreme rural environments, even though they are, of a good genetic stock and they're pretty isolated. There's not like a ton of, interplay of mites or competition, between hives as much, but there's just so little forage.
Yeah.
I've really been observing. Yeah. I've just really been observing that so much more this year, that true link between, when you're malnourished and you're hungry, that's really going to affect your immunity. And that's really going to mean the difference between a colony surviving and not, even if they didn't have, huge mite loads or anything like that, just the stress of, not having enough to eat. So anyways, that's kind of ancillary to this, but just in terms of, the environment that you're keeping bees in and what an impact that can have on, even the basically more or less identical genetics.
Yeah, no, I mean, nutrition is very critical. And there's been a slew of research now on how poor nutrition just exasperates everything else. So mite populations, virus loads all become much more critical at lower levels when bees are stressed nutritionally. And exactly. It's a growing problem. We have escalating numbers of beekeepers. We have reduced amounts of forage. And I mean, there are now lots of movements to improve plantings and to try and fill in some of those dearths, but it's become very, very difficult. So for people considering transitioning to treatment-free beekeeping, what kind of losses can they expect to see? What would you consider sort of an acceptable colony loss rate, especially in your first few years?
Yeah, so I have been sort of following some of the work over the years of the Bee Informed Partnership. I love the data that they collect, and I think they sort of, they collect kind of crowdsource from all different sorts of beekeepers from around the country in the U.S. And it seems like from what their research has said, more or less 40% loss rate is pretty standard now. And I think that's from both, an average of beekeepers that use treatments that are more traditional and those that are going treatment free. So I think that's kind of what I kind of base my understanding of colony loss generally off of. I would definitely say that it's going to be a little bit higher for treatment free, especially if you're, within your first year or two of going treatment free. I would say maybe something like, 50% loss, 60% loss in your first year, could be even more than that. So I think if you're trying to transition, it would be really important to make sure that you have enough colonies to make it worth it. I wouldn't recommend, if you have 2 colonies, to say, I've had these colonies for 5 years and I've treated them every year, and I think I'm not going to treat next year and kind of see, I'm just going to turn into treatment free or, overnight. Right. And I think that that's a little bit unrealistic. So I think it's just really important to remember that if you are going to try to kind of segue into that more, treatment free model, to know that you're going to have, 50 or 60% loss. And then those subsequent, colonies that do survive, then trying to breed off of them. And then hopefully within a few years, you'll have a stronger kind of couple of queen lines to work off of. But that's definitely one thing to consider is, you're going to have a little bit higher losses, potentially even, hopefully not as much as 75%, but I have heard, it can be up there. Right. So I feel like maybe like 50% would be an acceptable loss rate for treatment-free beekeeping. I mean, it's not ideal, of course, but I think also if you are kind of feeling that that's the way that you want to go, and you're really focused on, having the, strongest bees survive and then breeding off of that survivor stock, then just know that, you should probably have at least like 10 hives to start with, because you might lose 5, 6, possibly even 7 of them. So, you have to basically be okay with losses, and it's really difficult. And it's been very difficult, as a treatment-free beekeeper, to try and, every year I have more and more people that want me to manage hives for them. And it's been very difficult, to try to build that, if the, product or whatever you want to say that you're working with, if you have something and then suddenly you don't, then you can't, offer that if there's nothing to offer. So it's a little bit difficult in that regard in terms of, something service-based like what I'm doing. So, you have to kind of balance those expectations and, know that you're going to have losses.
Well, and financially, that's a huge hit for somebody who's just getting into beekeeping. 10 colonies, the purchasing in price is high. And then to watch 60% of them sort of crash in your first year and you're left with 4, especially if you don't yet know how to make splits and build those numbers back up from your own stock. I could see how somebody sort of does it a year or 2 and then they're like, ooh, this is not for me. I can't stomach it. Yeah, totally.
And that's really what has kind of pivoted for me this year. I feel a responsibility as someone that's, providing a service, but also really providing education. I feel like it's really important to provide, the broad, reaches of all the things that are possibilities within beekeeping, and to not, it's not my job to put my own ideals of, what beekeeping means for a new beekeeper. A lot of new beekeepers that are getting into it, they want their bees to survive. And if they've invested in the equipment, in the bees, in paying me to come out and help them for all those things, I also have to understand and respect them wanting to protect their investment. And then also it's emotionally, some people get very attached to their bees. And so then it's also managing those expectations. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, I got into it in 2001, and I think I started with 3 colonies. And if I had lost 2 of my 3 the first year, I'm not sure I would have stuck with it.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I really want people to have the experience and the joy of beekeeping, and I want people to have success, know? So it's been interesting to try to navigate, my own ideas about what I think is best for the bees. Sure. And then also consider, what is going to make it so that people actually have a positive experience with beekeeping and stick with it. And then, are able to do good things by the bees. And like for me, I didn't, through beekeeping, I've become so much more interested in like gardening and planting flowers and doing things that are otherwise beneficial for bees. And I think that the more people that we teach about beekeeping, they're also going to realize like, oh, I should be doing more gardening,
Yeah. No, I fully concur. I just actually wrote an article for Bee Culture about honeybees being the gateway bug and how it's the working a colony and seeing what they're doing and what they're visiting makes you in tune with so much of these ecosystem services, and you sort of get a whole new appreciation for the interconnections. So I find beekeepers are very, very important for pollinator protection in general, because those are a huge force that's advocating for bee benefits. So
absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more.
So Santa Cruz is a pretty mild climate where you don't really have a winter brood break. This allows you to constantly be managing the brood nest and potentially creating brood splits to reduce varroa pressure. But the bees and the mites can also keep breeding year-round. Do you think this mild climate hurts or helps you in your varroa management?
It's a great question. So Santa Cruz does have a mild climate. We don't really have a hard winter with, snow and ice. So it can kind of be equally challenging to places that have more of an intense winter climate.
Sure.
There they have, that torpor where they're not going to have brood consistently. If the queen breaks from laying, they're not going to have bees reproduce, which means they're not going to have mites reproduce.
Yep.
Where we don't really get that same brood break. But the brood nest does shrink a lot, I think, with day length and temperature, things like that. So I would say that, I tend to keep smaller hives, like you were saying, the, single hives, let them swarm more kind of approach to natural beekeeping. So, but I would say that, I'll have maybe a single deep colony that I'll keep, just one deep the whole year. And, they might shrink their brood nest to be like, 10 to 25% of the size that it was in the summer. So it does shrink a lot. It might be, one frame of brood. But because of that, you can't really successfully do like a brood break or splitting a colony. You wouldn't be able to, do, splitting a hive to prevent varroa late in the year. And And then, of course, we do, because we have, cooler, we kind of have a rainy season as our winter, and the days are shorter. And I will see a few colonies that keep drones over the winter, but most all colonies get rid of all their drones as well. Right. So we don't really have, it's not, like for instance, when I was keeping bees in Maui, we had huge brood nests the whole year because it was really still very warm and there was still a ton of forage the whole year. In Santa Cruz, it's definitely different than it was there. So I would say that overall it's, it kind of hurts the varroa management because one argument that I've heard that I think is interesting too is that, friends of mine that have bees in these colder climates, they say that, in more temperate climates like Santa Cruz, those weak colonies, they can kind of stay alive because they don't have this hard freeze.
Whereas their mite populations stay alive too.
Exactly. Totally. So if we were to have the identical colony, in upstate New York, and it's, this smaller colony with, not a huge population, they're not probably going to have that critical mass to stay alive during that cold winter. So in colder climates, sometimes you automatically just have those stronger colonies be the ones that survive. So I think in some ways, the weaker colonies can kind of be like coddled along. Yes. Over the winter. And so in some ways, I think it can kind of be a challenge. And it's really quite interesting because nutritionally, we were talking about food earlier, and we have basically absolutely no forage here, more or less from about July until December.
Oh, wow. So that's rough.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah. So it's almost like an arid kind of desert-like climate. And I think it's gotten worse with climate change and drought that we've been having, but we have essentially like a rainy season, a dry season, and a fire season. And so our winter,
I will try to avoid the fire season. That sounds awful.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, it's kind of intense, but one of the interesting things is that we do have kind of a Mediterranean climate. And so we have a lot of we also have a lot of eucalyptus trees here. And so we have some of the
that's a really good nectar source.
Type. Yeah, exactly. And those tend to bloom in the winter. So we actually, winter is sometimes when colonies are able to kind of build up. So we have like an earlier start. So I feel like even though it kind of rains over the winter, it's been sort of inconsistent, but it's almost like, December until July, we have pretty good forage. Yeah. So yeah, it's sort of, and it shifts every year too. So, even when bees are available and when people want to start hives, it's entirely dependent on when we get rain. And we've been getting rain later and later. So we've been getting rain like February, March, April, and sometimes even into May. And of course, as with queens trying to go mating flights, it's really difficult. So trying to pinpoint a time for people when they can get bees is becoming more challenging.
Yeah, so. I reared my own queens when I was making nukes in Maryland, and I had one April which is my nuke making season, where I had 24 days of rain in the month of April. Yeah. And you just forget it. There's no way your queens are getting mated.
Yeah. No. Your queens are never going to get mated. Yeah. And they do really have, kind of a critical period when they really can get mated. And so
exactly,
it's sort of, it just, you have to just kind of write off a round of queens at some point.
Well, they didn't even come back. I mean, some of them did try to fly out. And I think the birds were also so hungry because there was just nothing available, that they're just like this giant tasty snack that's flitting around for the...
Oh yeah, definitely. So yeah, I would say, that the kind of temperate climate of Santa Cruz has pros and cons, I would say.
Right. So what do you wish traditional beekeepers understood about treatment-free beekeepers like yourself?
Yeah. So, we kind of touched on it earlier, but I think an important thing to know, and one thing I wish that traditional beekeepers knew, more specifically about me as a treatment-free beekeeper, because I can't speak for everyone that doesn't just, it has the title of treatment-free beekeeper.
Oh, but, I'm sure there's a huge spectrum of all along.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it's, there's one thing to be a bee haver. and to not really manage your hives, and to
Right.
maybe even, some people might even say neglect your bees, and to just sort of get bees and say, cool, I'm going to have this natural colony. That natural colony would not normally choose to live in your 1-inch pine box that you put in your backyard, typically speaking. So I think even the act of obtaining bees is a little bit unnatural. So, you have to consider that context. And so I think shifting away from kind of the title of treatment-free beekeeper, making like an assumption that means non-management
Right.
is important. So I think, for me, I'm very diligent about inspecting colonies. And I have, specific things I'm looking for. And as I said earlier, occasionally, if it's really warranted, might consider using a treatment. So I'm definitely not opposed to that. I think it's just really important to also be really aware of, what you're looking for and what your goals are.
Right.
And so, I think just, I don't like that a lot of the literature for more traditional beekeeping just says, you need to treat at this time, no matter what, prophylactically. I think I like the idea of being a little bit more discerning about when something is really necessary versus not. So kind of inspecting and checking on that. And then, just because someone chooses not to use a chemical input in their hive, it doesn't mean that they're not being careful in their management.
Right.
So, like I was saying, all of the different sorts of, culling of drone brood or breaking the brood cycle, splitting hives, all of those sorts of things for mite management are, definitely still a part of that due diligence for caring for a hive. So I think, all of those things,
Yeah.
tracking the outcomes of hives.
I always tell beekeepers that there's a wide spectrum and you have to decide where you fall on that, from totally treatment-free to only synthetic chemicals, and that each decision you make as to what you're comfortable with means you usually have a different management technique. And so the more you move towards treatment-free, if you still want to keep your colonies alive, often that means more intense, in some ways, management, so that you're staying on top of your populations and monitoring them, so that you see problems arising before they get out of hand.
Exactly. Yeah. In a lot of ways, I mean, to be a successful treatment-free beekeeper, you probably do have to do more management than you might in a more traditional setup where you just know, okay, it's this date, I'm going to, apply this treatment because, that's the protocol I'm following. So yeah, I think there's all sorts of ways to keep bees. And I think that's the most important thing. Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
So is there anything else you would like to add that I didn't touch on?
Yeah. So I just want to add that I think these titles of treatment-free and traditional beekeeping, in some ways they can really stand to divide us rather than uniting us as beekeepers. And I know for me, I want beekeeping to be, equitable, and I want it to be available to people. And I don't want people to be discouraged from keeping bees. And I want them to know that it's something that anyone can do.
Right.
So rather than focusing on differences, I think kind of extending an olive branch and trying to understand each other's points of view can really get us a very long way. So I think, for me, I love learning new things, and I'm a lifelong learner, and I'll admit when I'm wrong about things, or, when I've changed my opinion. I think it's also always okay to change our opinion and update, what we're doing. So
I would be very worried if people didn't change their opinion. It means they're never growing.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I think just really thinking about, embracing and understanding all the different sides of, possibilities, and, trying to understand, all those perspectives. None of us know everything there is to know about bees, nor will we ever.
There's no one way to keep bees. I mean, it really depends on, like I said, it depends very much on what your goals are for your colonies. And then you have to choose an appropriate management strategy.
For sure. Yeah. So there's always new research and data coming out all the time. And so I think just, that should continue to influence our knowledge and our management practices. And so kind of keeping up to date with what that new information is. I mean, I feel like I think of when Samuel Ramsey found the, discovery of the varroa mites really consuming the fat bodies rather than the hemolymph of bees. And that was like a couple years ago. And it was just this idea that everyone had that was this thing because it was written in one paper. And so it's like those sorts of things that was like a breakthrough moment where people were like, oh, this is actually different than we thought. And that might mean different things for, the ways in which we manage hives or, the ways that treatments should be developed for targeting different things. And so, the best thing that we can all do for the bees is to continue to learn, to be open to new ideas and let that kind of guide the care that we give to bees.
I fully concur, and I really appreciate you taking the time to have an in-depth conversation. I have one final question, which I ask everybody, is that if you had to choose a pollinator to represent you online as your online avatar, what pollinator would you go with?
Oh, man. Well, that is such a hard question to answer. Right? I have so many pollinators that I love. Honestly, maybe a bat. And I don't know a lot of different species of bats, but I just know that they are, unfortunately, kind of have been maligned in culture. They have been maligned, yes. And also, I have a dear friend, Marm Kilpatrick, who's this great researcher at UC Santa Cruz, and he's actually been doing a bunch of stuff on disease ecology and epidemiology of COVID-19, but he does a bunch of research on the white nose disease that bats get and all of the troubles that they've been facing. And I love kind of hearing about his research. And, bats are super important pollinators that they're kind of like, people think of them almost like rodents or something. And they're kind of like, think of them as being graceful. Kind of picky, but they're beautiful. And they're, I was traveling in India and Nepal a few years ago, and we were at an outdoor restaurant, and there was this huge mango tree, and there were all of these huge fruit bats on it.
Oh my God.
And they were just amazing to watch. They were so cool.
Yeah, I posted a video of a fruit bat that was taking off from a laundry line that was spun outside. And it's like this 3.5 foot wingspan. It's just so graceful watching it go. It's insane.
Yeah, it was amazing. And it was actually like one of them flew in sort of to the restaurant. Someone freaked out, and it was like, they were like giant birds, they were beautiful and graceful. And so, I love bats. I love all pollinators, but I think bats are super cool.
I fully concur. We actually just ran an interview with the head of Bat Conservation International, and it's fascinating how important they are for the agave in the Southwest. So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm looking forward to learning more about all pollinators in my life.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate having the chance to chat, and much success with all you do and customer service.
Oh, thank you, Kirsten. It was really fun to get to talk, and thanks so much for having me on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for that great interview, Kirsten. I learned a lot in that. She seems like she's right on top of her game.
Yeah, very much so. And I love that her husband calls her a beekeeper's keeper.
You mentioned it before we started, Kirsten, and I got to admit, she really was very precise in her definitions and made them easy to understand. And I think the thing that is best about all of this is that treatment-free is not non-management; it's in fact intense management. And probably more so than if you're just using a chemical to get rid of mites. So I'm going to guess that even though the losses are going to be somewhat higher, you're going to be a better beekeeper if you do this religiously.
Oh, I think if you want to be a true hands-on treatment-free beekeeper and keep your colonies alive, you're going to be in your hives frequently, checking on them, managing them, intervening when needed so that you're not causing problems for your neighboring beekeepers. And I really like that she emphasized that she doesn't want to be the problem for others in her vicinity. I think that's a very important point. Treatment-free definitely doesn't mean hands-off. If you want to keep your colonies alive, you have to be in there inspecting them regularly.
And the long-term good thing of this is that eventually you're going to have bees be breeding bees from the survivors, you're going to have a population that is beginning to show some resistance without any intervention at all. So,
Yes. I mean, it's much more difficult in a more urban environment because everybody around you is bringing in drones and colonies from non-treatment free colonies. And so, of course, your queens are flying out and mating with whatever drones are in the air. So it's much more difficult to have full control of your breeding situation in an urban or a beekeeper dense environment.
Well, it was a good interview. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. I enjoy people who are willing to talk about both the pros and the cons and really get into the nitty gritty. That's where I tend to learn the most.
Absolutely. Well, that about wraps it up for this podcast. Before we go, I want to encourage our listeners to rate us 5 stars in Apple Podcasts, wherever you download and stream the show. Your vote helps other beekeepers find us quicker. Even better, write a review and let other beekeepers looking for a podcast know what you like. As always, we thank Bee Culture, the magazine for American beekeeping, for their continued support of Beekeeping Today podcast. We want to thank our regular episode sponsor, Global Patties. Check them out at www.globalpatties.com. We want to thank Strong Microbials. Check out their probiotic line at www.strongmicrobials.com. And finally, we want to thank you, the Beekeeping Today podcast listener, for joining us on this show. Feel free to send us questions and comments to questions@beekeepingtodaypodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. Anything else we want to mention?
Can you make the snow go away, Jeff?
Yes, but it's going to take me till about April.
We'll see you then.
Okay, take care.